My name is Joe Schumacher. I'm with the Akron Fire Department. I understand everybody has busy schedules. I appreciate everybody showing up tonight. Quick acknowledgement, Chief Clarence Tucker, thank you for your support in this matter. APD for showing up over here in the corner. Also, Eileen Shapiro's office. We have Lori Pesci and Tommy Smoot in the back for their financial support of this lecture. And Local 330, Steve Barker. Yeah, he's in the back. He's the one that provided the refreshments.
I'm not Local 330. We're Local 330, not just me. It's all of us.
Thanks, Steve. I'm going to introduce Dana Zadak. She's the Senior Director of Educational Services for Summit Victim Assistance Program. She's going to be our key speaker tonight. So let's please welcome her.
So I'm super nervous. And some of my family said, "Why are you nervous? You speak all the time. That's your job." And I said, "Well, I'm talking to heroes." And I don't say that in a kind of like cheesy way, because I know what it feels like when people say, "Oh, you're a victim advocate. Oh my gosh, you're my hero. I'm so impressed by you." And I want to go, "Ah," you know. So I got that. That doesn't always feel good, but I do feel like I'm in a room of heroes. And thank you for having me here. I'm going to talk tonight about how seeing trauma every day impacts us. So I'm a victim advocate. I've worked in victim advocacy for 30 years. I know you're saying she doesn't look that old, but it's true. And so in that job, I have worked side by side with law enforcement and have deep appreciation for that work. And my husband and now my son are firefighters. And so I have a deep connection to all of you as first responders. And so I worked with Matt with Akron Fire and kind of talked about how this work affects us. How does it affect us and what do we do to survive that? And that's why I'm here. So I'm going to be talking to you tonight about some of those things. These are my objectives. I'm a pretty relaxed speaker. We have kind of a smaller group here. I was surprised to hear that 80 people had signed up for this. I don't think there's 80 people here, but I get that. Because, you know, it's not an easy topic for us to address. As police officers, as dispatchers, as firefighters, as victim advocates, it's hard to say that what we do, what we've chosen to do for our work, impacts us. It's hard to say. So I have tremendous passion. You're going to hear that tonight. And some of you that know me in this room know that I have tremendous passion about the work that I do. And so when I was in my 20s and my 30s, and people would say, "Does this work impact you? You know, how does it affect you?" I would say, "No, I'm fine. I'm good. I'm handling it." Because this work meant so much to me. Dealing with people who've experienced trauma was my heart and soul. And I know that's true for police officers. I know that's true for firefighters. I know that's true for dispatchers. Like, you feel like you're a part of a family. You feel like you're doing this work, like you have a calling. Like you're doing this work for a reason. And for me to say to my boss or to my coworkers, "I'm struggling. My heart hurts." It's like, well, she can't handle this. She's a wimp, right? And I know that's even bigger for first responders than it is for victim advocates. So I have a lot of passion about sharing my information with you all, and I suggest that you get this information from each other, because getting it from first responders that do the same thing that you do is important. but also getting it from other first responders, getting it from other experts. You're going to have to take this in because what you do is important. You're heroes. Whether you're retired, whether you're in it, whether you're in administration, you're heroes. And so, what do heroes do? To take care of themselves, to prepare themselves, to be fit for duty. That's what we want, right? We don't use that word in victim advocacy, fit for duty. That's not a word we use. But because my CEO has a partner that's a retired sergeant with Akron Police Department, and because I have a partner that's a firefighter, we kind of look at things a little bit differently, and we say, no, we do need to be fit for duty. And you all need to be fit for duty, right? Physically, you need to be fit for duty. What about mentally? What does that mean? We're going to talk about that tonight. Where? Joe. Seriously, what happened? Because that's just not right. I mean, we practiced today. We were here at 2 o'clock this afternoon to make sure that our AV equipment worked. And it's not,
Joe, did they,
kind of not working.
did that time out? Huh?
What? What's happening?
No, I don't know if that might be timed out.
What? It's Dave's fault?
I think they projected.
It's Dave's computer. Ugh. This is the worst nightmare as a speaker, right? I mean, I came here and prepared and got all the stuff ready, but that's okay. We're gonna roll with it because what happens when you work in crisis? You adjust. You adjust, right? You adjust. And so we will adjust. So I don't want to ignore that we are a group of first responders. And being somebody that's worked very closely with the police and then having what I considered family as my firefighter family, like, do y'all get along?
Yes. Police and fire?
Police and fire, do you get along?
Sure.
Yeah, well, you have a little thing, right? You do have a little thing. I looked up some like comedy routines that I wanted to put into this PowerPoint about firefighters and police. Most of them were not appropriate for this, so they had like, sketchy content. And although I know that you would get a kick out of it and you would laugh, it's probably not a good move for me, right, in doing a professional presentation. But we do have something in common. Police, firefighters, dispatchers, victim advocates. We see trauma every day. We see trauma every day. And even if we don't visibly see it, because I know there are some departments that, can go a whole day without a call. Certainly for victim advocates, we have, times when we aren't in touch with trauma. But our work, our core work, is about being exposed to trauma. And so that's the thing that kind of bonds us together. What does that mean? So the statistics are scary. I mean, that's just the bottom line. They're scary. It's not about if you are impacted by trauma. It's about when you're impacted by trauma. Truly. It's not about if, it's about when. It's about planning for it. So don't be sitting there thinking like, I'm a tough guy, or I'm a tough girl, or I can handle this, or I'm so committed to this that I'm going to be okay. Because, yeah, that's awesome, but it still impacts us. It still impacts our hearts. Still, when I drive down the turnpike with my partner, he points out things on the side of the turnpike that impacted him, and I point out things that have impacted me. That's what we do when we're on the turnpike. Not because we plan for it, not because we want to process about it, but because it's heavy. It's here. It's in our hearts. And I know it's in your hearts as well. And so how do we look at that? How do we deal with that? Here are what the stats say. It's scary, huh? It kind of is scary. And we've had things that have touched us personally in our own community. Recently, we've had things that have touched us. So, kind of digging into this and talking about our exposure to trauma. So there are two different types of kind of stress that we get from trauma. There's primary and there's secondary. So victim advocates, the work that I do, working with victims of crime, working with victims of trauma, we have secondary stress. I'm not cruising into a situation and my life is at risk. That's not what I do in my job. I am hearing about people's trauma secondarily. Some of you, many of you, are moving into a situation and you are being exposed to trauma in a primary way. And what makes that difference is that your lives are exposed to danger. So police kind of have both, right? You hear about trauma from other people, you're taking reports, you're hearing that secondary trauma, and then sometimes your lives are at risk. For many firefighters, you're walking into a situation where your life is at risk. And that is primary traumatic stress and secondary traumatic stress that we are being exposed to. Sometimes people say, well, you signed up for it, right? You signed up for that. Yeah, I signed up for it, but I didn't know it was going to hurt this bad. I didn't know it was going to affect me. I didn't know it was going to raise my blood pressure. I didn't know it was going to give me migraines. I didn't know it was going to cause depression or anxiety. I didn't know that, right? Nobody said that to me when I signed up. And yet, we know factually that primary and secondary trauma do have an impact on us. They have an impact on our hearts, and they have an impact on our bodies. I think it's very interesting that in Chinese, they have characters, right, that they communicate with language-wise. And the characters for crisis are a combination of danger and opportunity. Crisis, whether we are community members and we're experiencing crisis, or we're first responders and we're exposed to crisis, is danger. It's danger to our bodies, it's dangerous to our heart. But there's opportunity, right? There is opportunity for all the people in the community, but there's also opportunity for us, and that's opportunity for growth, and that's what I want to talk about today. But first we kind of have to dig into some of the sort of core responses that we have to trauma. Who's heard of fight, flight, or freeze? Right? Probably all of you. I've done crisis work all my life. For 30 years, I've worked with victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, shootings, all those kinds of things. And so I see myself as a fighter, right? I'm a fighter. If I deal with crisis, I'm going to be the fighter. That's how I'm going to respond. That's totally what I believe to my core. My husband and I were a part of a trauma. 2 years ago, we're both ski patrollers, and we were staying at a ski lodge in Michigan, and a domestic violence abuser, I know, how sad, because I've done this work all my life, a domestic violence abuser got into an argument with his girlfriend, and he set the room on fire that he was in this hotel, and we were staying in the hotel. And then he went and removed all the fire extinguishers from the building. And the 3-story hotel that I was in Boyne, Michigan, was on fire. And someone was banging on our door because there were no alarms. They were banging on our door. I was with my husband, a firefighter. And I'd like to think of myself as being that fighter, right? Fight, flight, or freeze. I'm the fighter, right? I'm a victim advocate. I'm totally the fighter. What happened is that this person banged on our door, said the hotel was on fire, it was 1 o'clock in the morning, so we had to, dress. So we get dressed. There's we're on the first floor, and there's a sliding glass door, and we start moving out the sliding glass door, and we're throwing stuff out of the door. Mostly my husband is throwing stuff out of the door. And he sort of pushes me out, maybe like, I don't know, 100 feet, out into the snow, and he says, "Stay here." I have a lot of friends in this hotel, a lot of friends I care about. So I'd like to think that I would be the fighter, right? That I would go in, that I would help to save them, that I would do something productive. You know what I did? I stood with my mouth open. I was frozen. I was scared. I was frozen. I was numb. I couldn't even tell you what I was thinking. I was frozen. He moved. He pushed stuff out. We had a lot of expensive equipment in there. Skiers have expensive equipment. And he was throwing stuff out the door, and he was moving, and he was talking to me, and I was still standing there, frozen. So what I want to share with you about that is that our brain makes decisions. Our brain impacts us when we've experienced trauma. Now, you all get trained for that. He was trained to act. He was trained to move. Police officers are trained to move when that trauma hits you. But that doesn't mean that the chemicals in your body aren't still moving in the same ways that they are for everybody else, for every other human, for the non-heroes that exist. The chemicals are still moving, and they're still happening, and they're still impacting our brain. And so I want to talk to you about those chemicals, because those chemicals are still impacting all of you. You're taught to fight. You do stuff. You have process. What do you call them? SOPs? Something like that. You do stuff. You have a way that you operate. And you've taught yourself that. But the chemicals are still happening. So let's talk about those chemicals. What happens in the brain? So, 4 chemicals that are big releasers when we experience trauma. Catecholamines, that's the adrenaline, right? That's kind of the stuff that makes you fight. That's what you guys are tapping into. That's what you've trained to tap into. It's important to remember that this release happens 24 to 48 hours after you've experienced trauma. So even though you're trying to go home and relax, and I've experienced this having a partner who is a firefighter, you're trying to come home, you're trying to relax, you're trying to defuse, you're off your shift, and you're trying to but these chemicals are still happening in your body, okay? So it's important to remember that. They help the body fight. So when those chemicals are released, you love those chemicals. First responders love those chemicals because they help us to do something, to act, to help, to solve, and to save, right? Prolonged or frequent release can lead to significant medical issues. What could those be? They raise our blood pressure. They create anxiety and depression inside of us. So regardless of how awesome we think we are, how prepared we think we are, these chemicals are still happening and they're still being released in our body, and they're sending messages to our brain about how we function. And sometimes that happens afterwards too. How many of you don't have to raise your hands or answer, but how many of you have experienced a critical incident, something big, and you think oh, it's been a day, right? I gotta move on. I'm okay. I'm functioning fine. And yet you still feel those chemicals being released in your body. That's these chemicals. Cortisol. Cortisol gives us energy. It's one of those things like adrenaline that helps boost us up. It helps with the fight. It may also help with flight. It may help with running or getting away or keeping ourselves safe. Prolonged or frequent release of these chemicals can have an effect on our bodies. Again, high blood pressure, heart disease, all those kinds of things. It does impact us, right? Opiates. This is the natural morphine. This is the good stuff. This is the stuff I saw when I very first went into this work. I was working at the Rape Crisis Center, and I went on a call to the hospital for a woman that had been sexually assaulted by a stranger. He broke into her home, he raped her, and then he left. And her husband came home soon after, and he took her to the hospital, and that's when I interacted with him. And I was like 20. And I had taken rape crisis training. I was like, I'm going to do a good job. I'm going to work with this couple. I'm going to help them. I totally, even though I had heard from training that people respond to trauma differently, I totally expected them to respond a certain way. And when I got there, they were cracking up. They were laughing. They were making jokes, and I was like, what? What is this? Now that I'm 51, I kind of look back at that couple and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm sure they're still together. They laughed. That's what they did. That's how they coped with trauma. Because my guess is that those hormones were going crazy inside of them. That's how their bodies responded to trauma. It attempts to counteract physical and emotional pain. It may tie into freeze. So I might have a lot of that going on in me. We're trying to examine that. It can impact short and long-term memory. So we know that. So what happens sometimes when law enforcement goes and talks to somebody and they're trying to get information about what has happened in a situation, and the person like is sketchy, their memory is like back and forth, maybe they don't remember pieces of it. That's because opiates have been released in their brain to help them deal with trauma. And yet sometimes, as first responders, we think, what's going on with that person? Are they telling the truth? That seems weird. Why are they acting like this? It's chemicals being released in their brain. And then the other one that happens is oxytocin. It increases positive feelings, kind of like the opiates do. Sometimes it can show as bluntness. So how many of you sometimes have that blunt feeling about what you've experienced in your jobs? Oh, hands. I like that. Yeah, that happens. It's like, it's okay. It's no big deal. It's that bluntness. It's that numbness. It's that I can handle this kind of feeling. And you probably thought this is just the way I'm dealing with it, but they're chemicals that are released in our brain, causing our brain and our emotions and our behavior to act a certain way. One of the things that we do in victim advocacy is that we talk to victims about this. We talk to people who've experienced trauma, and we tell them about this so that they can kind of understand what these reactions are, and they can help. It helps to normalize those reactions. So let's talk about some of those reactions, because I'm not a doctor. I don't know all these things like for a fact and for sure. But what I do know is this. What I do know is that these are responses and reactions to experiencing trauma, and that as first responders, whether you are a victim advocate, whether you're a police officer or a firefighter or a dispatcher, you are being affected by trauma in the same way. So we like to think like we have superhero costumes on and we're not being affected, but we are. And here are the responses that we see from trauma. We see nervous energy, jitters, muscle tension, having that upset stomach. I don't need to read through all these. You know what they are, right? You've experienced them. You've experienced them because you've experienced this trauma in your work, but you've also seen this in people that you've worked with, right? People that you've responded to. And these are very common responses to trauma. And so one of the things that we do as victim advocates is to help people understand that these are responses and that they're normal responses. Normal responses to an abnormal situation. What happens when you see those normal responses every day? How is that different? What does that look like? What does that mean, right? We were just having a meeting at our office, and we were talking about, like, you know, things that we could do to comfort each other and sort of mitigate our exposure to trauma. And some of our staff were talking about bringing puppies and dogs to work. I know that seems super weird to you all, but victim advocates do that. We have a little bit more luxury to do things like that. And there were this big group of our staff that were like, we want to bring our dogs to work. And there was this other group of staff that were like, we are at work and that's not professional. And one of the things that I kept thinking inside my head is that our staff see dead babies. Our staff see dead people. They see blood. They see trauma on a regular basis. And not even to the extent that some of you do as first responders. And so what does that mean to us? Like, how do we handle that? Do we just stuff it? Do we just say, it's fine, this is what I've chosen to do, I'm okay? Or do we deal with it? And I say we deal with it. And I have some suggestions on how you might be able to do some of that. So, I'm not going to talk a lot about post-traumatic stress disorder tonight because I'm not a clinical person. I'm like a grassroots, reactions kind of a person. But I don't think that we can mention this topic without talking about post-traumatic stress disorder. I was thinking, like, just in my own house, right, of like what we experience with PTSD. That I have a partner who has been exposed to physical and sometimes emotional, but more physical and trauma, and has those memories and carries that stuff in his heart. And I'm being exposed to trauma on a regular basis, like, wow, could the two of us be walking around with PTSD? So the two of us have not been diagnosed with that, and some of you might not have chosen to go and get clinical help and be diagnosed with that. But my feeling is that as first responders, many of us are dealing with PTSD. So we can't ignore that. We need to have an understanding of it, and we need to know there's help for that. I thought this video was a good example of that.
Attention. We have a collision involving a child approximately 5 years old. Eastbound Lansdowne at Monaghan, requesting immediate response. Phil, what you'll discover at the scene is that the child has been dragged underneath the vehicle and remained conscious the whole time. She'll ask, am I going to die? You'll need to assure her she won't.
So what do we do? We're first responders. We respond, right? I mean, all of you heard that. You would respond. You would be there. You would go. You would help to assure her that she was going to be okay. I know every single person in this room would do that, as would I. And when we do those things, as we do in our regular course of our jobs, we hold some of that pain and we hold some of that trauma in our hearts. So we have to figure out kind of what are we going to do with that? And I do have some suggestions. I don't want to ignore that we probably should take a break, right? Okay. So we're going to take a short break because this is a long presentation and we're dealing with heavy stuff. So when you come back, we are going to, I'm not holding this secret of how you deal with your trauma. When you come back, we're going to talk about that. We're going to take a short break, probably like 10 minutes. So if you can come back in, I would appreciate that. And we'll share our secrets about how to deal with trauma. So let's talk about what my field of victim advocacy calls compassion fatigue. And compassion fatigue involves primary and secondary stress. So we know that as first responders, you're dealing with primary stress. That's when your life is at risk and you're responding. And then secondary stress, traumatic stress, is when you're hearing about or you're seeing the aftermath of that trauma. We are dealing with vicarious traumatization. We're going to talk about that. And we're dealing with burnout. We're going to talk about that. The causes of this is our exposure to trauma, bearing witness to suffering, our empathy. And I know first responders are empathetic. I mean, victim advocates, we kind of we wear empathy right here on our sweatshirts. But I also know that you all have a tremendous amount of empathy, and that impacts the trauma exposure that you have. It makes it worse. It makes it heavier. And yet, in some ways, we can't do our jobs if we don't have empathy and compassion, right? You hear that. You're told that by leaders. You have to have compassion for the public, right? Another cause of our compassion fatigue is isolation and alienation. Sometimes you can't really talk to people about what you do, right? So for many, many years, my primary work was working at a rape crisis center. And so, sometimes we would go to parties on the weekend and people would be like, well, what do you do? Well, I work at the rape crisis center. And they were either like, wow, you're a hero, and that's amazing, and sometimes that feels uncomfortable for us. Or they would be like, okay, I'm going into the other room, and I'm not going to talk to you anymore. Because it's hard for people to understand what we're exposed to. It's hard for people to understand that, and sometimes it's even hard amongst ourselves. So I told you that my partner is a firefighter, and I'm a victim advocate. We see things very differently. Our trauma exposure is very, very different. And sometimes I understand where he's coming from and vice versa, and sometimes I don't understand at all and vice versa. So that happens. It alienates us. It makes us feel like, oh my gosh, nobody really gets this. Nobody understands what it's like to see this kind of stuff. How do you explain that? One of our staff said that she was doing therapy, and the therapist said, when you close your eyes, what do you see? And she said, dead bodies. And she said that the therapist was like, so she kind of felt like maybe this therapist doesn't get it, right? Because she does see that. You see that. What does that mean? How do you deal with that? Issues of meaning. What are we here for? What are we doing? I know that my issues of meaning have changed from 21 to 51. Why I got into work to help victims of crime is different at 51 than it was at 21. And that's going to be true for you all too, right? How you see the world is different. And our workplace can sometimes cause more trauma. I mean, that's the truth. Sometimes the institutions, the workplaces that we are involved in don't support us in the way that we need to be supported in how we're exposed to trauma. There's a quote that says, the expectation that we could be immersed in suffering and loss daily Are we immersed in suffering and loss daily? We are. And not be touched by it is unrealistic. And it's like expecting that we could walk through water without getting wet. One time when I was working at Battered Women's Shelter, one of my very young staff said to me, "It's kind of unsafe here and kind of scary." And I was like, yeah, because we have 25 women that are staying in our shelter who are being stalked by abusers. It is kind of unsafe and scary. You know, what we do, what we are choosing to do is unsafe. It's scary. It exposes us to trauma. But that doesn't mean that we're in a position where we have to say, well, we're exposed to trauma, so, you know, we bought into it. We signed up for this. It's okay. You know, like, no, we can still be taking care of ourselves and still be paying attention to how we deal with this. So I want to just kind of go over some of these definitions so we're in the right place. And we talked about primary and secondary trauma. It's a direct result of hearing or seeing shocking material in one's work. It's increased by perceived threat. So when you are dealing with primary trauma and your life is at risk, your stress level is going to go up. Personal trauma history puts us more at risk. Now, of course, I'm not going to go and say, if you've experienced personal trauma, or raise your hand. Not going to do that to you guys. A lot of people that get into working with trauma, who get into being first responders, certainly I can speak for my field, people who get into doing victim advocacy, we sometimes bring some bags with us, right? Sometimes we have to carry those bags across the street. We need wheels. We need entourage to carry the bags, whatever it is. If we have bags of our own trauma, it is going to have more of an impact on us. Because what happens is that those chemicals in your brain get released when you've experienced trauma, and they're more likely to pop out when you see trauma again. So if you come to this work and you have childhood trauma, you are going to be more impacted by the trauma that you see. And then the other kind of thing that's true is that the longer that we're in this work and the more that we're exposed to trauma, the more it's going to impact us. Which is kind of scary for me, in a way, as a 50-year-old woman who's done work with trauma survivors all my life, is that as I go through my career, and I'm getting smarter, and I'm getting stronger, and I have more to offer, I'm also being exposed to trauma more, and my body, and my heart, and my brain are being more impacted by trauma. So I have to, at 50 years old, pay attention to what I'm doing to take care of how I'm being exposed to trauma. And if we don't take the responsibility to do that, we are going to be hurting. We are going to be on disability. We are going to be leaving our jobs. We are going to be searching for other jobs. We are going to be drinking more than we should. We are going to be gambling more than we should. We're going to be doing all those things to cope with our trauma if we don't handle it. Vicarious traumatization, what is that? Is it different? It is different as far as the definition goes. It is the process through which caregivers' inner experience is transformed. It's how we are changed. So the only example that I have for myself with that is that if you talk to me at 21, I was like, oh, everybody is savable. Everybody is, I want to help everybody. That's where I came from, right? I was totally in that mode. And when I left Battered Women's Shelter, we had a priest contact us, a priest who wanted to dress like Santa Claus and talk to our kids in shelter. And I was like, are you kidding me? Really? A priest who's going to have little kids on his lap? That is different. That is not what I came to this work with. That is not what I would have said as a 20-year-old. So my worldview, how I see things, has changed because of being exposed to trauma. And that happens to us. Sometimes you hear people talk about like cynicism, or, you know, this person has an attitude because they've been a cop for this long, or they've been, you know, first responder for this long. That's what this is referring to, is that vicarious traumatization. It disrupts the basic identity, our worldview. It can affect our spirituality. That's a big deal. That's who we are. Now our work is changing who we are at our core. It has to do with meaning and adaptation. So the most devastating impact of vicarious trauma is in the realms of hope, meaning, specifically in cynicism and pessimism. Do you hear that? Do you hear that from your coworkers? Do you hear that from your internal voice? That's vicarious traumatization. And it doesn't mean that you're doomed. It doesn't mean you can't do this work, but it means you need to pay attention. Right? Burnout. Burnout's the most like despicable thing to talk about in this presentation. Burnout is about being under chronic stress. Burnout is not about the context. It's about the context, and it's not related to the content. So it's not about us being exposed to trauma. It's about the fact that, what kind of examples that can I come up with that can relate to you all? It's about the fact that your chief says that you have to wear a certain uniform. It's about the fact that for a social worker that the caseload is 100 people instead of 20 people. It's about the politics that happen in your departments, in your organizations. That's what burnout is. And it does affect us. It does have impact on us. So we can't go without, recognizing it. Some of the telltale signs are emotional exhaustion. Just that cynicism that can come up, depletion, conflict, just feeling like, really, what am I doing this for? Why am I involved in this? And so I mentioned burnout, not because it's related to trauma, because that's what I'm talking about today, but because sometimes in the work that we do when we're serving the public, we're dealing with burnout. I mean, think about law enforcement right now and what law enforcement deals with. You know, in the preparation for this presentation, and I was looking at things that I wanted to put in the beginning of the presentation, like I found this super funny comic that was talking about firefighters and law enforcement. It was super funny. I found a lot of inappropriate stuff. But it's that connection, that connection that happens. And that exhaustion that sometimes happens with us with burnout, and we can't ignore that because it exists. These are two quotes that I've heard in my career. One from a police officer that said, "This work isn't really having an impact on me," right? And in the fire family that I have been able to be a part of in Hudson, we had a loss. A child was lost from two firefighters that were a part of our family. And one of those firefighters said to me during that funeral, "I'm choking. I'm literally choking and dying inside from the pain that I'm feeling." No tears. Not one single time did he have tears. And so I look at this and I think about, like, what kind of BS are we telling ourselves as first responders about how we deal with trauma? And what can we do to change it? So it's breaking down the stigma. And it's breaking down the stigma in general for our whole world about mental health issues. But specifically for us as first responders, is one, we need to be educated. You guys are here. You're being educated. That's awesome. You can share this with other people in your department. Having compassion for each other. And that's not always empathy. It's not always like, I hear your story and my heart bleeds and I hurt and I go home and I'm thinking about my coworker and I'm like struggling over it. It's that compassion. It's having a little bit of distance, but also saying like, I'm concerned. I'm concerned about this person. So it's having that compassion. Reducing the stereotyping. What do your organizations or your departments say about getting help? We have some really crappy views about people getting help. Even in victim advocacy, where we have counseling like at our fingertips, and that's kind of where all that touchy-feely stuff. We are not good at it. What does it mean to you? You know? What do you say to each other about getting help? Connecting with people that hold you accountable. So sometimes I have a couple people at work that are like, you're working too hard, you're doing this, you're not, like I need to hear that. You need to say that to each other. I'm concerned. You look sad, you look stressed. What's going on with you? Holding each other accountable for those things. Connecting with community. We need to connect with community because we need to understand that community gets us, and we need to educate them about what we do as first responders. Avoiding comparison. That's why I liked that this was police and fire. Who's going to say that firefighters have more trauma than police officers? It's different. What you all deal with is different than what I deal with as a victim advocate. But avoiding that comparison to say, like, my trauma's worse. Okay, you get a gold star, your trauma's worse. We are all experiencing this type of trauma. Monitoring our conversations as far as like getting help. What do we say about people who are mentally ill, people who have a diagnosis of depression or anxiety or post-traumatic stress disorder? I would guess that most of us in this room would qualify for a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. And yet, what do we say about people who have those diagnoses? What do you hear? We even hear stuff at our place. I just heard a victim advocate today say that somebody in the waiting room was crazy. She felt like she was informing her coworker, right? And she's good. She's a good advocate. We're not bad people. But that's what she said. How do we say that about each other? How do we say that about getting help? We need to make that okay. And it's you all that are going to make that happen. Helping to confront misperception. To be able to say, hey, trauma has this impact, This person is struggling because they've experienced this. Being able to say that to people. Let's talk about some short-term solutions. And these are best practices that we know of for victim advocates, for firefighters, for police, for dispatchers, anybody that's dealing with trauma. So one is that we know that the more training that people get, the more prepared they're going to feel to do their jobs, and the less they're going to be impacted by trauma. Good for you all, because first responders do a ton of training. Victim advocates, we've learned some things from you all about that. My CEO at our organization, her partner is a retired sergeant with Akron Police Department, Sergeant Bruce Graham, and my husband is a firefighter. And the more that we talk about the kind of training that our partners do, we said to each other, we need to step up our training, right? That's kind of how I got my job at our agency, is that we said we need to be training at the same level that you all are training. So the next time you have to go to training, and the next time you feel really crappy that oh my gosh, I can't believe I have to do this, or I have to meet this requirement, or I have to get this sign off, or whatever it is for you, is that the more that we're trained, the more we have the skills to do the jobs that we're required to do, the more we're going to be able to deal with that trauma. If we don't feel prepared, we don't know what to do. If you're a firefighter and you go out because somebody's been buried in a trench, is that a real thing? Somebody's been buried in a trench and you've never had training on that and you don't know how to deal with it, you're going to be more impacted by that trauma. If you are a police officer and you don't know how to deal with people that are on heroin and dealing heroin and dealing with that whole situation of overdose in our community, if you don't have those skills and you don't have those resources, you're going to go out into the community and that trauma is going to impact you more. So when we feel capable and we feel in control, then we're in a better position. So think about that with your training. I don't have to tell you, I don't have to convince you to do more training. You guys are doing lots of training. So being fit for duty, so that's a legal, like, labor term, right? For us as victim advocates, it's a term that we get from you all. And fit for duty means, to me, you're dealing with your own stuff. What do you got going on at home? What do you got from your childhood? What kind of trauma are you dealing with? And have you processed that? Have you talked to a counselor? Have you talked to somebody from your place of worship? Have you just talked to a friend or another coworker about those things? Because if we don't deal with our own stuff, we're not going to be able to deal with trauma on a daily basis. We're just not. It doesn't work like that. We have to be fit for duty. We have to think about that. Minimize media exposure. You all are way better at this than victim advocates. We're all over social media, all that kind of stuff. I know that you guys have a little bit more control over those things, but like, what do you see? What are you watching? What are you hearing? What are you taking in? So I had this staff person that worked for me a few years ago in rape crisis, and she had a partner that was out of town. So they did a lot of talking on the phone. And he was a counselor. And he would sometimes say to her, "What are you doing tonight?" And she would say, "Well, I'm watching Law and Order, or I'm watching CSI, or I'm watching some show." And he would say, "Why are you eating trauma burgers for dinner when you deal with trauma all day long?" So sometimes when I get home, I've told my partner this story, sometimes when I get home I'm like, "What are we doing tonight? Are we eating trauma burgers or are we not?" Like, can you turn that stuff off? Do you need to turn that stuff off? I'm thinking about that. Your job duties. So this is kind of my little plug for Victim Assistance Program. Victim Assistance Program responds on scene. The police officers in this room know that. They call us on a regular basis. We have an agreement with Akron Police and we have an agreement with Barberton Police to respond on scene. We don't get a lot of calls from firefighters or EMTs, but we would get calls. And the benefit to you all is that what we know about trauma is that you are less impacted by trauma when you are focused on a specific job duty. If your job duties expand and you have to do something else, that sort of makes you more vulnerable to trauma. And so putting yourselves in a position to have to talk with people about their trauma, help people find housing, help people do death notification with their children about losing somebody in their family, all those kinds of things, we can help you. Call us, call us, call us. Akron Police totally knows how to do that. We have one phone number. You'll see it on our at the end of this presentation. It's on all of our materials out there. We can help minimize the trauma that you're exposed to by providing a job duty on that scene that isn't a part of your box. It isn't something that you have to do. It's something that we can help with. And whether it's something we can help with or somebody else can help with, it's about keeping yourself in your lane and not having to do things outside your job duties. What we find in studies about first responders being exposed to trauma is that when you have like mass trauma, you have a hurricane that happens, you have a huge fire that impacts like the whole city or something like that, that people are stepping outside their job duties, and they talk about that being more stressful and more impactful in regards to being exposed to trauma. So sticking in your job duties is a really good thing, and your SOPs and all the kinds of things that you guys do helps you with that. We're not as good at that, so we kind of have to talk about that. Support from each other, support from your boss, support from your partner. And sometimes you can get that support from outside people, and sometimes they just don't get it, but you gotta have that support. Making your mental health a priority. We make our bills a priority, we make our kids a priority, we certainly make our jobs a priority. I mean, I have to say that there were many years. I have 2 sons. One of them is a firefighter. And I have done work with trauma survivors my entire career. And there were plenty of times where I went like this to them and focused on my job. How can we make those priorities for ourselves? How can we make our mental health a priority in being that I need to give to my kids instead of being focused on my job? And when do we do that? Because our jobs are big. I just went and did training yesterday with Akron Police Department's Fast Track. Their new police officers. There's 6 of them. And when I got in there, I asked them what they had been doing in the morning, and they said that they were talking about being off duty. I'm like, whoa, what are you talking about being off duty for? Why do you got to talk about that? Like, what are their responsibilities off duty? What do they do? What do they do with their uniform, their gun, their responsibility to report, their social media, all that kind of stuff? Like, we have to, because our jobs are so big and they're so consuming, and they're a big deal. I mean, because we're wearing capes, right? They're a big deal. So how do we make our mental health a priority? What do we say about that? All right, we're going to talk about breathing and grounding. I'm a yogi. I'm not going to make you guys do yoga or anything like that. But I am going to talk about breathing, which is something that I've learned from yoga. And it is something that we can deal with in the short term. So when we are having a response to trauma, whether that be at that instant, which I think you all are trained to push that aside. I get that. You're probably more trained than we are as victim advocates. Or whether it's an hour after you get home. Whatever that is for you is like, how can you use your breathing to give you strength? You'll see up here, and I'm not going to go through it, I'm not going to make you guys do this, but just a way to kind of have some control over your breathing. If you've never experienced this before, I suggest you Google it. I suggest you look into it. Breathing is a way that we can control the stress that we're feeling and control the trauma that we're experiencing in a very real way. And practicing it when you don't need it is the best idea, right? So I do that at yoga all the time. I'm breathing, I'm practicing breathing, and what it reminds me of is that sometimes how I'm not breathing. So I don't do a lot of direct service anymore. I mostly do education, but sometimes I am put in a position where I do direct service. And I was just at the courthouse the other day, and I was sitting with a victim in the courtroom, and I realized, because I'm a yogi and because I do breathing exercises all the time, that the entire time that I was sitting with her, I was holding my breath or doing shallow breathing. Why? Because I was invested in what was happening with her. I was worried about her. I was thinking about her. I wanted to be professional. I wanted other people in the courtroom to see me as professional. I was stressed, just like I was when I came here tonight. I'm talking to all of these firefighters and police, and they're a big deal, and I'm stressed out. Like, how does that affect my breathing? Am I shallow breathing? Or am I breathing the way that it says up here, where I'm actually expanding my belly, and I'm taking that breath in, because that oxygen coming into my heart, coming into my body, coming into my brain is going to help me deal with the trauma that I'm experiencing. Some people maybe think that sounds silly, but it's real. It's very, very real. So check out, if you are into your phone and your smart apps and all those kinds of things, check out Insight Timer. It's a really, really good app, Insight Timer, that you can put on your phone. Doesn't cost anything. I don't know how much data it takes or anything like that, because I'm not a tech person, but you can put it on your phone. You can use it to do some breathing exercises. It has some messages that it sends you about kind of being mindful and taking the time to breathe, but they're short. And that's what I like, because I don't have a lot of time in my life. I do a lot of stuff. I work, I volunteer, I'm a ski patroller. I'm doing a lot of active stuff, which is good for me. That's another way that you can deal with your stress and your trauma. But I don't necessarily think, oh, I'm gonna take 5 minutes and look at my phone and do some breathing. That's something I have to be mindful about, and I'm guessing that you all are the kind of people that you would have to be mindful about. So I'm asking you to try it. I'm asking you to put it on your phone or look something up on Google about breathing and try it and see if it works for you. The other thing that can be helpful in the short term as far as being exposed to trauma, especially if you are somebody who is experiencing some symptoms of PTSD, is grounding. And that's kind of like getting physical with your surroundings. So let's say I'm sitting in here and I'm getting ready for this presentation and I'm freaking out. My mind is like, it's spinning around, I'm stressed out. Being able to ground is about feeling your feet on the ground. It's about feeling the chair behind you. It's about tasting stuff that you're eating. It's about being in the present and experiencing what your surroundings are and kind of grounding yourself. And it's a really good way to help control some of the stress responses that we have from being exposed to trauma. So just exposing you to it, putting it up here, saying check it out, especially if you're someone who has been diagnosed with PTSD, that it's something that may be helpful to you. Look, Joe, our videos work. So I wanted to put a few videos in here that kind of talked about PTSD. This one is specifically about law enforcement.
I mean, every day is different in police work. You never know what that next call is going to be. It could be a cat up a tree, it could be with a gun. You just never know. It's an adrenaline rush, but you have to keep it in check. It's a lot. And your family does suffer sometimes. So I continued to say, show me your hands, and in one motion, turned, wheeled, and raised the gun. At that point, we exchanged gunfire, and I realized that I had been shot. I spent one night in the hospital. They ran a bunch of tests. I had to see our police psychologist to get cleared for work. You kind of get the blessing, yep, you're good to go, and everything seemed fine. It's kind of like get back on that horse. I knew something at that point was starting. I had headaches, didn't know why, thought maybe it was just stress. I started to have flashbacks of that muzzle flash, that ball of fire from 10 feet, and I would wake up at 3, 4 in the morning, and I couldn't go back to sleep. I'd wake up soaked in sweat. I would pace the house at 3 in the morning. and see the trash man come and fool me. It was like I was almost afraid to go back to sleep for fear of getting back into that nightmare. And I wasn't putting it all together as stemming from that incident. You know, as cops, we're supposed to be strong. We internalize it and we don't talk about it, and it builds up inside. So once I realized that I needed to take some time and figure out and get my head back together and fix my head, I never had given that a thought. You have all these military vets in our department that saw battle and saw time, and they're all fine. And here I am, struggling. I just got shot in the leg. It wasn't like anything crazy like these guys have experienced. It was humbling and embarrassing. And I said I would do whatever it took, and I did. I never stopped the treatments because I was still having the symptoms. Yeah, I was able to better handle it and deal with it, but the symptoms were still there. We just kind of did baby steps, and I gradually increased my time at work, and next thing I knew, I was back full time. At one point, and I don't know when it was, I started to realize the night terrors were gone. The muzzle flash was gone. The irritability, the anxiety had diminished. And I don't think it was until I went back to work and got back into the everyday routine of being a cop again that the symptoms subsided. Sometimes it takes hitting that rock bottom, and you just hope that rock bottom isn't a bad situation. We put guys out all the time for whatever injuries they have, and they're out until they're better. And we accept that. But the mental health aspect of our job is something that we need to focus more on. I'm not a big public speaker. But in this case, I don't mind sharing. For me, it is therapy in itself, just talking about it. It does make me feel good that I can be a success story, to be able to, tell somebody that it is possible to get through this. That's the story that I want to share with people.
So we want to have that hope, right? We want to pay attention to ourselves enough that we can keep doing our jobs, because we're all doing our jobs, whatever they are, because we care. My guess is that many of you chose to do this job as a first responder because you wanted to help people. That's what we hear. That's what I hear when I talk to firefighters. That's what I hear when I talk to police officers. That's what I hear when I talk to victim advocates and dispatchers. We want to help people. And so how can we do that when we're being exposed to trauma all the time? We do that because we build resiliency. Now, many of us have tons of resiliency. We wouldn't even be here. But there are ways that we can enhance that. There is a quote here from Dr. Michael Ungar, who is very big in resiliency. He says, in the context of exposure to significant adversity, that's what we see, right? Resilience is both the capacity of individuals to navigate their way to the psychological, social, cultural, and physical resources that will sustain us for our well-being. And what we know are these things over here: awareness, agency, meaning and purpose, connection and support, and then self-care and revitalization. So we're going to talk about each of those. Awareness, energy drainers and energizers. You have those people in your life that are drainers and energizers, right? One of my energizers is right in this room. He's the chief of the Hudson Fire Department. So he's part of my firefighter family as a spouse and is an energizer for me. So when I saw him walk in, my heart jumped. I felt happy. I smiled at him. I felt energy. But we also have those people in our life. There's none in this room for me. That are drainers to us, right? Sometimes those are people that we work with. Sometimes they're our boss. Sometimes they're our spouse or our mother or our sister or whoever we are connecting with in our family. So being aware sometimes of the trauma that you've been exposed to and how you need to be cautious about those energizers and drainers in your life. Can you say, no, I'm not going to talk to my grandma tonight. I'm going to call Chief Barnes and I'm going to talk to him. Like, who can you find that's that energizer and that drainer so that you know who's going to have that impact on you? Looking at your triggers. So we talk to all of our staff about what are triggers for them. Your triggers are different. You do different jobs than victim advocates, but for us, we kind of talk about our teenagers, your triggers, our kids, your triggers. Is it a trigger for you when a crime involves an animal? What is that thing that like sets you off? And then the red flag is how you know that you've been set off. And so we do this thing that we call MAP with our staff. It's a mindfulness action plan. And we go over it with all of our staff and we talk about what their triggers are, what their red flags are, and how they can build resiliency to do this kind of work. And when I do this with all of our staff, and when I sat down with one of our staff and I said, she said, a trigger for her is working with situations that involve children. She feels like they're so helpless and just it's so sad and she's very triggered by that. And I said, how do you know? How do you know you're triggered by that? What's the red flag? And she literally picked up her hand and went like this. I feel it right here. Where do you feel it? Do you feel it here? Do you feel it here? Do you feel it here? Where do you feel that trauma and that stress in your body? Because when you know that, you can then say to yourself, I'm having that feeling. I'm having that feeling. I'm having that feeling. You are recognizing that that is something you are being triggered. And then you can make some choices about that. So knowing how your body, and everybody's body is different, responds to those triggers and being able to recognize that is going to help you be able to deal with it. Agency. Agency is a fancy way of saying choice. The choices that we have. So for us, in victim advocacy, I kind of talk about one of the first calls. So I had done domestic violence and sexual assault work for many, many years. And one of the first calls I went on for a victim assistance program was a suicide. And the person who had died by suicide was hanging in the backyard of that house. I had never seen a body hanging in the backyard. Never seen a body hanging, period. Do you think I wanted to look? Right? I'm human, just like we all are. That's why people watch CSI. That's why people watch Law and Order, because we want to see things like that. We're curious. I wanted to look, but for me, I had the choice not to. I had the choice not to. I get that in many, many circumstances, you do not have those choices. You have to look at that dead body hanging from a tree. I get that. But where do you have choices? Because you do have them. How can you make those choices about what you see, about what you're being exposed to? Even if your choice is not to watch CSI when you get home, is not to watch the Justice Channel, right? Those are choices that we have, and we can make choices. Viktor Frankl wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, and he wrote about people in concentration camps. And one of the things he said, and I will read this quote even though it's up there for you all to read, he said, "We who lived in concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, and that is to choose one's attitude in any given circumstance, to choose one's own way." So we all have choice. And one of the things I remind our victim advocates is you have a choice about working here. You all have a choice about being first responders. I hope that you'll still make this choice. I value what you all do. Our community needs what you do. But individually, you each have a choice about whether you want to do this work and be exposed to trauma. And then you each have a choice as your careers go on about what you're going to do. I've been listening to sexual assault and domestic violence survivors for 30 years. It hurt my heart. It hurt my heart, and I loved my job. But I needed to make some choices and some changes. And so I've been able to do that in providing education. You know, where can your careers go? Maybe there's a difference in where your career can go. Maybe there's something else that you can be doing that would be satisfying to you and use the skills that you have. Maybe there's a situation in each circumstance that you deal with that can help you look away from that body that's hanging from the tree. When you're able, make those choices to reduce your exposure to trauma. Because a lot of times, and the gentleman who was a detective or the police officer talked about this, and we talked about this at the break with someone. We're a little bit crisis junkies, right? Right? You know, you have to admit it. I am too. And so sometimes we seek those opportunities out to expose ourselves to more trauma. Like, oh my gosh, are you kidding me? We need to do this? We do it. And so think about that. Be mindful about that. Because you may be making some other choices about being exposed to trauma. Meaning and purpose. So I think this is one of the coolest things that we have about building resiliency, and I think this is something that draws us all together as first responders, is doing something that we were meant to do. How many of you think that you were meant to be a first responder? You were meant to be a dispatcher. You were meant to be a police officer, a firefighter, a victim advocate. I mean, I feel like that for myself, and I know that many of you do too. So that's something that builds a resiliency. It's something that we can add to our tool belt, and we can feel like, you know, I'm doing this for a reason. I have purpose, you know, and connecting to that purpose is important. We have a shared experience, you know, and that can help us look at meaning and purpose. One thing that we don't always get as first responders, and we certainly don't get it as victim advocates, is being able to see vicarious post-traumatic growth. What the hell is that, right? That's when we see that people survived and thrived, and it's all those cheesy things that we see on TV sometimes about, you know, this community experienced this trauma. They had this explosion, they had this hurricane, they had this tornado, and they all bonded together, and they have this, like, you know, connection, and they're growing and thriving, and sometimes we don't get to see that as first responders. I think for police, you probably get to see that the least. You know, you don't get to see the good stuff. You see the crappy stuff, and you don't get to see the growth necessarily. I think that's true for firefighters and EMTs too, is that you respond, you go, you handle the situation, you don't necessarily know where it's gonna turn. Dispatchers get that. You hear someone's pain and their trauma coming across on that phone, and you are doing your process and you're sending somebody there, and then you're hanging up and then you're done. Victim advocates have that as well. We get that too. Like, we're going and helping somebody, but we don't necessarily see what the outcome is. We don't get the good story. So if you aren't getting the good stories on the people that you are impacting, how can you find the good stories? Where are they? Are they on social media? Are they in the news? Are they on movies? Find those post-traumatic growth things that you can watch, even if they're not connected to the first response that you had. So that you can say, when I watch something on TV and it's this rape survivor and she's feeling like all empowered and good, I say to myself, that's what I did. That's what I did. I never talked to her. She's an actress. It's a whole fake thing. But that's what I did. So find those places where you can say, this is how I impacted the community. And that's that post-traumatic growth. And we know that has an impact on us. Spirituality. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this. I surely don't consider myself an expert on this. It's something I've struggled with. And in some ways, I think I've struggled with it because of the trauma that I've experienced. But what's your spirituality? What's your religiosity? How can you connect to that? So there was a study done, even with first responders here in Summit County, and what they found a couple commonalities in how people deal with trauma. And one of the things that they found is that the worst time for people to deal with trauma is between 40 and 50. It kind of makes sense because maybe people have been in their careers for a little while and they're feeling like the heaviness of all that trauma. Of course, when I heard that, I was like, if I just hung in there till 50, I could have done this, right? But that's what the ages show. And the other thing that we found from that research study is that people who consider themselves to be highly religious dealt with their trauma better, and people who considered themselves to be very low on how they rated themselves religiously also dealt with their trauma very well. Kind of interesting, right? So the people that dealt with it very well and who considered themselves to be religious were connected to a purpose bigger than themselves. And the people on the other end of the scale, that would be me, considered themselves to be impacted by a larger purpose. And for me, I consider that to be the case. I work with victims of crime and trauma, and it's a big picture for me. And I feel incredibly devoted to it. And so that helps me to deal with my trauma, where somebody else might be on the other end of the scale, so they don't see that as much, but they see themselves as very religious. They're very connected to their religious community. They see something bigger than themselves, and that's the purpose, is that we know people handle trauma better when they see that there's something bigger than themselves. That's connected to recognizing the beauty around you, So I like to think of myself as like an amateur photographer. I like to take pictures and I like to find beauty in different things. Sometimes I've found that beauty in our own firehouse and taken pictures of a fire truck's tire, right? Not many people would think that was very beautiful. And yet I took a picture of it and it's a fabulous picture. I'll give it to you. So where do you find beauty? How do you find beauty? How do you find beauty when you're a law enforcement officer and you're, outside and you're seeing like a lot of not beautiful things? Is where can we find the beauty and how can we bring that beauty in? Because that's bigger than us, and that's what helps us deal with it. And involvement. Being involved in something bigger than what you are doing in your work. So for me, I volunteered at the ski patrol. And for you all that might seem kind of connected to what you're doing, but for me it wasn't. I wasn't dealing with people's emotions. I was learning a process of how to do an assessment with people, and I was out in the winter and I was skiing. That was so different than my work. It helped me be involved in something bigger than myself, and I needed to have that. I didn't even realize it until years after. Meaning and purpose.
How do I know? A lot of people, when they think of the phrase, how do I know, they always want to put the what behind it. How do I know what I'm supposed to do? The question that you really should ask is, how do I know why I'm here? Because when you know your why, your what becomes more clear and more impactful. If you know, like for instance, people know that I do comedy, but that's what I do. My why is to inspire people to walk in purpose. So I can do comedy, I can write books, I can be in a movie, because all of it is motivated by my why. In fact, I have a new web series out called Michael Jr. Break Time. We probably just did the 6th episode. It's on YouTube. So every single Wednesday at 3 o'clock, we drop a new episode on YouTube of Michael Jr. Break Time. What it is it's me. I travel around the country and I do stand-up comedy, in case you didn't know. And in the middle of my comedy set sometime, I'll stop and just talk to my audience. And we've been filming this, and it's, you know, it's pretty cool. So we're in Winston-Salem. I'm going to show you a clip from Winston-Salem. And I'm just talking to this guy in the audience, and he tells me that he's a musical instructor at a school. So I was like, all right, you're a musical instructor. You know, can you sing? Let me hear you sing a song. So this is what happened at the last episode of Michael Jr.'s Break Time. Check it. So you're a musical director?
Yes, sir.
All right, so let me get a couple bars of like Amazing Grace. Can you do the first part of that? Go ahead. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Wow, that girl could sing. You know what I'm saying? All right. Now, once you give me the version, is if your uncle just got out of jail, you got shot in the back when you was a kid. I'm just saying, let me see the hood version real quick, if you know which version I'm talking about. Just see if that exists. Let me see what you got. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Okay, here's what I want you to catch. The first time I asked him to sing, he knew what he was doing. The second time, he knew why he was doing it. When you know your why, your what becomes more impactful because you're walking towards or in your purpose.
And I say when you know your why, you are building resiliency. You're building resiliency. So don't let anybody say, don't be proud of your thin blue line. Don't be proud of being a firefighter. Like, all of those things are what makes you strong and are what makes you more resilient, is figuring out that why and keeping connected to that why. And being able to speak up when you've lost your why. And we've all been in those positions. You know, that's so inspiring, right? To listen to that. But what if you're sitting here and you're thinking like, oh my gosh, I don't know my why. I don't remember my why. I can't remember my why. I'm too exhausted to remember my why. Dig and find out that why, because adding to your meaning and purpose is what's going to help you be more resilient. Connection and support. So it kind of leads right into that. Connection and support. Having a tribe. Having a family that you feel connected to. Again, sometimes, you know, society looks at us as first responders and kind of looks down on that, you know, connection. Or puts that connection in a bad light, you know. Like, that connection is important, just like it is for the military. It is for firefighters and law enforcement and dispatchers and victim advocates. Like, we need to know that we're connected to the people that have the same why. That's important. Our hope is what can help us build resiliency. And then outside support, but we have to be careful with our outside support. I do sometimes tell our victim advocates, like, don't go home and tell your partner about the dead bodies if they don't know anything about dead bodies, because it's going to be kind of scary for them, right? So you have to know who your outside support is. And sometimes it doesn't have to be completely connected to trauma. Working in sexual assault gave me this kind of perspective, and a lot of people don't want to share that they've been sexually assaulted or they've been raped, and so I would try to help people build a support system even though they weren't going to disclose that they had been sexually assaulted. So you don't need to call somebody up and say, oh, I saw some crappy stuff today at work, or I'm struggling because of my work. Maybe you don't even know that. But if you got an aunt that makes the best mac and cheese in town, and that's a comfort food for you, maybe sometimes you need to make that reach for support that's bigger than what you normally would think of. Maybe you just need to say to your aunt, I need a pan of mac and cheese, I'm having a rough week, or whatever it is. You call that friend or you call that family member that's going to make you laugh, and it has nothing to do with trauma, it has nothing to do with police work, whatever it is for you. Like, think about your support system as being bigger than sometimes having to disclose what happened to you at work. Because sometimes our people on the outside, they don't get it. They don't understand it. So we need to kind of like make it a little bit bigger. Self-care and revitalization. So in victim advocacy, a lot of our staff think about self-care as mani-pedis. And I hate to say it, but it's true. Well, you know, we want to take care of ourselves. We had a hard week. We talked to sexual assault survivors. We're going to get a mani-pedi. That's great. Good for you if you like a mani-pedi. Go out and get it, right, Chief? You do your mani-pedi. I don't know that. I'm just picking on him. But mani-pedis are great. Bubble baths are great. Massages are great. But self-care is bigger than that. Self-care is about calling the doctor because we have a bunion on our foot and we haven't dealt with a bunion and we need to deal with that bunion, and we have been procrastinating for literally years to call the doctor about the bunion. Whatever it is, it's paying the bills. It's eating decent. We're eating at all. It's sleeping. It's talking to our kids. Sometimes it's those things that like normal people, not superheroes like you all, do every day. And sometimes when we're dealing with trauma, we're just too exhausted. And it doesn't mean you dealt with trauma that day. It could be that you dealt with trauma for the last 30 years. So handling our business is building resiliency, and it's taking care of ourselves. Mindfulness and wellness, just paying attention to those things, being proactive about our health care, doing our financial planning, paying attention to our nutrition and our diet, paying attention to our downtime and sleep. Downtime? Do any of you know about downtime? When my kids got grown, So they're 26 and 31 now. When my kids got grown, I kind of like, you know, how we like assess our situation. Like, did I do a good job with these kids? Like, what do they do? Are they handling their business? Are they smart? Are they kind human beings? What are they doing? And you know what I said to myself? Oh my gosh. My firefighter husband and I did not do the best job with teaching our kids about downtime and sleep. Like, our kids are hyped up, they're active, they're doing stuff all the time, just like we did. You know, so we didn't do a good job with that. I recognize that. It's a way that we take care of ourselves. It's a way that we build resiliency. So how do you pay attention to your downtime and your sleep? What does that mean to you? Are you sleeping? Are you not sleeping? Do you need to talk to a doctor about your sleep? People who are exposed to trauma on a regular basis don't really do that well with sleep. I know, big surprise for you guys, but it's true. Before we conclude, we only have 10 minutes. I know you guys are wishing that you were sitting in here for another couple hours, but we just have 10 minutes, and I want to talk about some resources. So you all have EAP in your departments and your organizations that you're working in. So seeking out your EAP and the resources that you have through your work is important. Victim Assistance Program is a resource for you. Now, I will tell you that it is best practice for first responders to help each other in being exposed to trauma, meaning police help police, firefighters help firefighters, victim advocates help victim advocates. When you talk about debriefing and formal debriefings that you have, critical incident stress management, which has been used, I know, here in this county with firefighters and police, those are things that you do with each other. And that's best practice. Why? Because we understand each other. So if victim advocates need to be debriefed, we're going to do that with each other, and you guys are going to do that with each other as well. So that's best practice, and I can't walk away from this presentation without saying that you should talk to your people. That's where you're going to get the most support. Sometimes we can't do that. Sometimes we're afraid to do that. I was afraid to go to my boss and tell her that I was struggling with hearing about sexual assault every day because I didn't want her to think that I couldn't handle it. So I was afraid to do that. If you are in that position, and you may be, there are other resources that you can reach out to. So Victim Assistance Program is one of them. We are mostly going to be the resource that helps you to help the community deal with trauma. That's our expertise. The Safety Forces Center, which I hope that you've heard about, which is on Furnace Street where we used to be located, has also services for you all as first responders, so you can check those out. They have a website. And then there are 2 anonymous hotlines, and I did call them yesterday. One time I gave a sexual assault hotline number out, and it was not a sexual assault hotline. It was another sexual hotline. So I always call the numbers. Call numbers if you're going to give hotline numbers out. So I called both of these numbers yesterday just to make sure that I knew exactly what they were. I have to say that the fire EMS helpline was a little bit nicer to me than the cop line, who I was like, "Hi, I'm Dana, I'm doing a presentation." They were like, okay. Anyways, they're awesome. They're there to help you. They're anonymous. You can give them a call. They have texting and chatting as well. And then they also have websites that you can check out. So, you know, if for some reason you don't feel like you can talk to a supervisor, you don't feel like you can get debriefing in your own department, you don't feel like you can reach out to your EAP, and I get that. I think that happens. I think we have to be realistic that happens. That there are other resources nationally and statewide that you can reach out to. We are always here for you guys. Without a doubt, Victim Assistance Program. We consider ourselves to be serving first responders and the community side by side, and we want to be supportive to you. So just know that those are always resources that you can turn to, and there's you know, brochures outside that you can get to. I got to talk about my agency because, you know, they expect that. We have 3 core services that we provide at Victim Assistance Program. One is crisis intervention. We do that through our hotline. We do that through people walking into our agency. We have on-scene response, so we do respond on scene, and we are trained to respond on scene, so like we're not gonna get in your way and like cross tape and like touch stuff. We know that we're not supposed to do that. So we have on-scene response, and then we also help with death notification, which is a responsibility of a coroner or, what's the other word I'm looking for?
Medical examiner?
Yes, thank you. Medical examiner, that's the responsibility per law in the state of Ohio for them to do death notification. Many times in our county, that gets sort of delegated to our law enforcement, and at Victim Assistance Program, we will help with that death notification. So good for you all to know that as first responders. So then if you take it to the next step from crisis intervention, we provide advocacy, and that's just kind of an ongoing way to help people deal with trauma. We go to court with people, we help with protection orders, we can help people get victim compensation. We just do that ongoing follow-up. We're going to stay connected to people who have experienced trauma. So those are our two main core services that we provide to the community, crisis intervention and advocacy. And then our third service is our Summit Victim Assistance Academy. Me and one other partner that I have in our agency. And then we have probably 4 or 5 other service providers at our agency that also do public speaking. We offer a class called The Essentials. We have had some first responders in our Essentials class. We teach people how to do crisis intervention with people who have experienced trauma. And so mostly we have victim advocates in that class, but we've had some firefighters, we've had some police officers, we have had clergy, counselors, magistrates, and prosecutors. It's a week-long training that we do in January, June, and August. You can check it out on our website if you're interested. We do customized professional training, what you all experienced here this evening. And we do education to the community. So basically anybody that asks us to come, you know, this church, Kiwanis Club, wherever, we'll go and we'll talk about trauma, we'll talk about crime and prevention, whatever people want us to come and talk about that's related to trauma, we'll do that into the community. And those are the topics that you'll see there on the side. There's our contact information. So, except that it doesn't have my name that I presented this. So my name's Dana Zedak again. Thank you for having me here this evening. I'm still super impressed that all these heroes sat in this room for 2 hours. Most of you I know were not getting paid. So I get that, and I just appreciate you being here. I hope you got something from it. I hope you got something that you'll share with other first responders. I'll be around for questions if you have any questions. I think that's it. Thank you.
On your way out, there's CE forms. On your left, on the right, there's some literature. Please take the literature and the refreshments. Chief, anything?
No, I just want to thank you personally for coming out and doing this for us. Again, please, let's give her a big round of applause.
APD, you guys got anything? Steve?
Thank you.
Lori and Tom? Lori, there she is. Anything?
So thanks to the County Executor's Office for bringing us.
And if anybody's parked on the county deck, I'll validate your parking.
I forgot about that. If you're parked in the county deck, they'll handle that for you. It's all